Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into the Garden, and we're bringing back one of our favorite and one of our most erudite guests, Mike Hilliard from the Red Line podcast, and recently did a 5-part series called The Green Line. So definitely check those shows out as well. Mike's coming to us from Australia, where it's 10 p.m. his time, 9 a.m. my time. So first of all, Happy New Year, and thank you for coming back in.
Always happy to be here. I think it's one of the first interviews of the year, so kicking off a good one.
Yeah, it better be one of the first. I mean, otherwise you're too busy. You need to take some time off. All right, so folks, we're recording on January 2nd. This probably won't drop on January 2nd because anybody who's been a long-time listener knows I pre-recorded my first 4 shows already, from the last show of the new year to the first show of the new year, which is part 1 and part 2. Excuse me, world. And that sort of segued into Arthur 2 ways, because we really gained Arthur 3 ways, and it necessitated itself. But after that, everything's fair game as to when things are going to drop. So that you have a little context in case the world goes squirrely in the meantime, it isn't Mike's fault. It's not that he didn't know, or, that's not what this show is necessarily about. But the Red Line podcast will keep you abreast of all sorts of things you need to know, things you realize that you don't know, things that you might have thought you knew. And basically it's going to teach you that the world is complicated, messy, scary, and just put in that Hobbesian quote about short, brutish, and, all of that other stuff too. But interesting. And this show hopefully will be interesting as well. The prior shows, one cleverly called The Red Line and another one cleverly called The Redder Line, because I'm just that creative. So check out those prior shows with Mike on the show. It's so kind of him to be on this little show, his show. He won't brag, but I'll answer if he's asked, but I asked him last time. But last time we spoke, he was getting between 1 and 2 million downloads per month. I cannot imagine that getting smaller, and with the Green Line, it probably doubled. So, or thereabouts, even in this slow time of year. So once again, congratulations for your continued success. We're thrilled to have you on the program. That's his line, by the way. It really is an honor. It's nice to, you're a real world guy with a real world following, and I'm a hobbyist, and, I'm so thrilled that you said yes once, and now it's your 3rd time, and now you're like extended family of the Garden of Doom. We have a swamp tree in your honor.
A swamp tree, Mark. That's the best thing I've ever heard.
That's right.
That's what makes it all worthwhile getting a swamp tree.
That's right. Its little eyes are still orange. They haven't gotten red. Its branches are growing talons. They're not quite there yet. It's like Groot. It's gonna grow. Don't worry.
Happy with that sums up my personality really well.
Perfect.
You always right there in the dirt and a bit spiky and a bit smelly.
There we go. We are Groot. So anyway, that was a de minimis Disney. Leave us alone. Anyway, so we're going to talk about private military contractors, mercenaries, gendarmes, whatever you want to call them, soldiers of fortune. So we have all seen them in movies and TV. People probably saw the movie The Contractor with Chris Pine not too long ago, where this is the last thing he wanted to do, but it was the only thing that was available to him. Every CIA show you've ever seen, you've got the wet work, the black ops, the really off book box, the in the pocket assets. Every British show that you've seen, the MI6, MI this, the capture, they're a lot of fun. Seems like there's a never-ending supply of these nameless, faceless bad guys that are super skilled but absolutely dispensable to our heroes. What is the real story on private military contractors? And we turn to our first and only expert of the program. Again, I'm stealing his stuff. Michael Hilliard, tell us a little bit about PMCs, which sounds like a really fancy name for brigands.
So PMCs is a really broad term. I mean, some kind of private military contractors are, quite a lot of what private military contractors do is just escort work. So, quite often they're ex-special forces or they're quite army officers, or they've been in the military previously, and they'll just be escorting a very rich banker from the airport to wherever he needs to go and back to the airport. And that's probably what the majority of these guys are doing. And again, it also wildly differs between countries. So, for instance, if you take an American PMC with a company like Blackwater, which was Eric Prince's company, those guys would operate and do the things that the American military didn't want to do. So there are some jobs which the American military may think are a bit icky for them to do, or frankly are easier to not have on their books, and they are detached from the US military. They're effectively a very separate, they get some briefings, but they don't get introduced like other ones. Whereas you look at Russia, where rather than America has lots of PMC companies that compete in the private market, with Russia there is only one. It's Wagner, who's run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who, even though he's not technically in the Russian military, they operate, side by side with the Russian military. Prigozhin will sit in on most of the sort of big decision-making processes in the Russian military. The PMC facilities where they train is right next to where the Russians train. Their headquarters is right next to Russian headquarters. They are almost another arm of the Russian military. And where they're useful for a couple of reasons. One, they have plausible deniability. So what PMCs you quite often use for is kites. So what a kite is effectively, if things get too windy, they just cut the rope. So if you want to go into Yemen and eliminate someone, give you monetizable, but eliminate someone, or you want to go sabotage something, or you want to go extract someone, if you have American civilians or American armed forces caught behind enemy lines or they're captured, that's a huge incident. Whereas if it's, PMCs that are caught behind enemy lines, who cares? It's mercenary, not the American government's problem.
Right.
Even though the American government may be aware of it at the time. So quite often you find that, for instance, Russian military guys professionally will only do, use what's happening in Ukraine now effectively is what they do, and some peacekeeping operations in countries like Armenia, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. Russian PMCs will effectively be operating in Mozambique, Guinea, Central African Republic, sometimes doing things as simple as guarding the president because the president doesn't trust his own guys. Sometimes it's as nasty as operating the mine sites. PMCs is a really, really diverse term, and sometimes it can be bodyguards. Sometimes it's, hiring these guys to massacre villages because you don't want your own army to do it.
So that really does happen. So they'll send in a squad of 12 people or whatever with extraction sites and all that, and they'll go in and they'll, gun down a village. I assume because that's where a strongman lives or a drug dealer lives or a competing warlord or whatever.
So, yeah, for instance, in Nigeria a few years ago, so Nigeria is quite a large country, and there's a bit of a split in the country. About 80% of the country lives in the south, and that's heavily Christian, and the north is very Muslim. and there's always a bit of split between them. And effectively, there was a lot of terrorism problems up in the north. They tried sending the Nigerian military to go in, but it gets a bit hairy because they don't want to go too harsh, because effectively, you don't want to massacre half a village and then expect them to vote for you afterwards.
Right.
So they did a few operations that didn't quite unlodge everything. So they hired a bunch of South African PMCs, and they just gave them a blank check and gave them a bit of a, we're not going to watch what you do. And they went very, very harsh and scorched earth, and got the terrorists out of there, but hit a lot of people in the process as well. So there are times where countries will do that, unfortunately.
So this,
but it is probably the minority of what actually happens to PMCs.
Okay, but the tip of the spear, so to speak, are the guys and gals who do subscribe to the theory that if you want to make an omelet, you gotta break some eggs, and we'll break the eggs. Don't worry.
Yeah, well, again, it's you deploy them when you have a reason to. So, for instance, if for Nigeria, for the majority, they're particularly when they're occupying an area or they want to take and actually use that town afterwards, that'll be Nigerian military who goes in, because they're far better at it. PMCs are much less worried about the civilian casualties. They'll just break things as they go, and that's a real problem. So it is that balancing act of, okay, do I want to be, if I'm a man at court, what do I do? Do I want that risk? If I know it's going to be high casualties. So right now, for instance, in Ukraine, Wagner is using a lot of PMCs. Well, Wagner is a PMC company, but a lot of effectively prisoners, odd guys, and whilst the really good PMCs in Wagner are effectively operating still in Africa and a few other places, all the dregs, the rejects from everywhere else are being sent in as not cannon fodder, but their lives are very expendable. And that way, when a Russian mother or Russians learn that we've lost 10,000 Russian soldiers, that's an impact. But if they go, well, it's 10,000 private mercenary prisoners, there's not nearly the political flashback. So sometimes you will hire PMCs to do jobs because their casualties don't matter as much. People tend not to view PMCs on the same. He was serving his country. It was he was looking for a paycheck, and that does give you that option as well.
So in the world sphere, there's our sphere. There's probably in the insiders, they probably know who the companies are. There's got to be someone who tracks these companies. Is there some accounting? Is there some what's the number of PMCs that are out there? Let's forget about like Pinkerton and Dunbar Armored Guards, things like that.
It's really hard to track, and the trouble here is about legality. So, for instance, when we did our first big PMC piece, we ran this actual scenario with a lot of international lawyers and guys who are experts in this, and going, okay, if I as a company pay a team of PMCs, if I, let's say, am BP, and I hire a bunch of PMCs to go blow up a Shell oil rig in international waters, or I blow it up in, let's say, Guyanese waters, who gets charged? Because then you get to the problem of you're hardly going to catch the PMCs on the ground because their operators are going to get in, they're going to get out. You'd be very unlucky to get caught. Okay, so, and even if you do, they'll say, hey, I'm just doing a job. I was paid to do this. And you go, okay, that leads to another kettle of fish of who's wrong, who's right. But let's say you don't catch them. Even if you find out the company that did it, so you go, okay, cool, this was carried out by probably a PMC company registered in Dubai, which is where a lot of these companies are. In Dubai, it's not a crime. So you would go to Dubai, the Emirati government, and say, hey, look, I know there's a PMC company that's registered in Dubai that's carried out this attack, and they go, it's not a crime, sorry, like PMCs are fine.
No, we can't help
then,
you.
Okay, so what about the company that paid this PMC company to do it? And again, then you've gone through eight or nine shell companies, and you're never going to catch the money either anyway. So it is really, really difficult to actually pin and regulate PMCs. And the trouble is that of the guys who would have to regulate it, let's say if the US really wanted to do something about it, or the UK, they don't really want to because they also use them, and
Sure.
they also like having the advantage of, hey, I like to use these guys occasionally to, hurt a country that I shouldn't be in, or go do something where I really shouldn't have US personnel on the ground, and I can hire PMCs to carry out that job. And if you regulate that, then the Americans might, even if the Americans were to have a really ambitious president come in and go to do that, there's no way the Russians would ever do it. There's no way the Emiratis would ever agree to it, and there's no way that the Chinese would ever agree to it either. And it's why that when there was some regulation of PMCs by the Obama administration, Eric Prince just picked up and moved his company originally to Riyadh and then effectively to Hong Kong afterwards. So it's a really difficult industry to regulate, and it's not one that people want to regulate either.
Right. And I imagine you could do the bodyguarding jobs domestically, but if you're operating in another country, are you committing a crime of the United States if you're operating in another country? I mean, that's an issue, here in the U.S. with the check fraud or internet fraud. I'm an internet scammer. I'm in Maryland. I'm scamming people in Nevada. Where'd the crime occur? I mean, that's where the federal government steps in, but it's it's not the same, I guess, here if there's no federal law on it, or if all they do here is bodyguard, but you send them into, I don't know, let's use our stand-in state of Jeffzikistan. They operated in Jeffzikistan and killed my fictitious brother Stewardistan, and under Emir Jeff's, the Sultan's instructions, did they commit any crime anywhere?
It's really, for a lot of the places that PMCs operate, which is mostly third world nations or developing nations, there's a couple of things. A, the PMC, even let's say he's escorting an oligarch of some variety from the airport to the bank, the bank to the airport, and someone stops his car, he gets out, he eliminates the person in front of him, and then he gets back in his vehicle and keeps going. Are the police going to get there in time? Probably not. And most of those, most of the countries these guys operate in, the police aren't armed that particularly well. And if you're going as a cop who's earning, not that much, and you're going, do I really want to think I'm going to arrest, very heavily armed PMCs who are already heading to the airport by the time you've got the call? No, it makes it really difficult to, no cop wants to go after them. And you know that if they have committed crimes, so for instance, quite often when guys have done it with Blackwater, but that before the investigation actually been started, they just ditch out of the country. And unlike US military, when a US military personnel does this, there can be a court martial, there can be someone to hold them accountable. They're in the military, they have a serial number, everyone knows what's going on. With PMCs, they leave the country, the company just tears the records up and goes, I have no idea who that was. It's one of our employees, it's too hard to find out. We'll put an internal investigation and we'll get back to you. And they just let it, go under the radar. And that's, it comes down to that. They can get away with a lot more because of it. And soldiers earn a lot more when they do it. So,
like everything else in the world, generally, most people in the know who the big players are. You've said Wagner a couple times. Wagner, I'm only familiar with the name because of our mutual friend, the Eastern Border. He talks about Wagner pretty much every show these days. So shout out to Kristaps over at the Eastern Border. Check out his work. It's pretty important, and he wears his stuff on his sleeve. He's from Latvia, and he's oftentimes on or behind the front lines. Yeah. So it's an interesting perspective. Anyway, but he talks about Wagner a lot. You've mentioned Blackwater a few times. I think they either changed their name or they had
they're now Frontier Services Group, and they probably changed the name again because they all change their names all the time. And it is really because they know that effectively any time that a PMC company becomes big enough that they start getting journalist attention, they'll change the name because they know that it is really difficult to get people. The only one effectively anyone remembers is Blackwater because they went through trials, and they changed their name immediately. And Wagner doesn't change their name because they're Russian and they are not just a private company. They're effectively a state monopoly.
Right, they're basically the ninjas of the mafia there. So they
private military companies are illegal in Russia technically. So which is a nice way of saying anyone who has a private military company apart from Yevgeny Prigozhin, who used to be Putin's chef and used to sell hot dogs in St. Petersburg before he became head of Wagner, weirdly enough. Anyone apart from Prigozhin would be arrested. Prigozhin can do what he wants.
Okay, so he sold hot dogs in the park. He was a hot dog vendor.
Yep. He sold hot dogs, and then he catered an event for Putin. Putin liked his cooking, and then he was willing to look the other way on a bunch of stuff, and Putin brought him into his circle as kind of a personal chef. And then, Putin gives a lot of roles away, not because you're good, but because you're loyal to Putin. So he knows that, I can give the head of the Wagner services to Prigozhin and know that Prigozhin will never say no to Putin. If Putin says, I want you to chuck 80% of your men into a blender, he'll go, no problem, sir, let's get that done. And that's why Prigozhin was given that job, because he's very loyal to Putin. He's played the right cards, he's helped the right people, and in power struggles, he's deployed Wagner to the right places. That's why he has the job.
Well, there's a metaphor something in how you make hot dogs and sausage and this whole meat grinder thing, but we're going to leave that one alone. That story itself is amazing. I mean, he can't possibly be a military tactician, so obviously someone else is running the strings, or at least running the ops. Does Putin handpick his generals or lieutenants for him, or whatever you call them, his executive vice presidents?
Yeah. So he'll have a lot of very high up ex-Russian military guys up there. And as I said, they also do coordinate with the Russian military. When Prigozhin is deploying troops to somewhere, he's doing it with the blessing and usually the advice and military support of the Russian state military. And that's the difference. When it's when Eric Prince or another American PMC does operations, they don't often have to consult with the US military unless the US military is subcontracting them. Whereas Prigozhin does nothing without the approval of the Kremlin.
Right. Now, I know that, I know from Chris that, a lot of the stories we're hearing about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine right now, where you're getting people taken out of prison and the labor camps, whatever, and basically just, putting on the front lines. That's actually the Wagner group, which I guess is that plausible deniability you're talking about. Probably also, a lot of those folks have sort of been written off by society and their families to an extent, or sort of out of sight, out of mind. If you've been serving hard time for, 8 years or 18 years or whatever, in the Siberian labor camp or just in the regular prison, if they have those there, you probably, people have moved on. They don't really miss you because they've already sort of moved on with their life. But aside from Wagner and, what did you say, Blackwater's Frontier now? The
Frontier Service.
Who are sort of like the big players? Like when everyone hears, one of the favorite bad guys in the U.S. is Halliburton. The Cheney's group. Wherever the U.S. something nefarious is going on, Halliburton is there, and then Halliburton will tell you, well, we do the things that you don't want to do. We will build those pipelines and we will guard those pipelines in northern Nigeria, which isn't safe for Exxon to do or whatever it is. So, of course we get, $12 billion to do it because no one else will do it. Okay. I guess I can see that. But is Halliburton a PMC also, or do they hire someone else? And
so Halliburton will pay other PMCs to do stuff. PMCs are designed to be as detached as possible because you don't want, you want them to get dirty, so you don't. Halliburton will happily hire guys because they do not want a Halliburton employee doing something really rough. Because with PMCs, you always have that plausible deniability. Look, it wasn't American soldiers who killed these people. It was, it was a mercenary or bad mercenary. We're going to investigate that and look into it. The media will probably give up in 4 months' time. So again, there's a lot of companies who will give them money to do it, and again, that makes it difficult because we can never tell where that money comes from because they're private companies. They don't open their books, and even tracking money across, they're going to run that money through probably Dubai, to which Dubai is not going to let us know who's been giving and what, and that makes every investigation trail go cold. Sure. So it is really difficult to actually see who's paying who's doing what. But no, it'll be. These PMCs are effectively just PMC companies. They're usually backed by very large companies, or they're backed by, in some of the Hong Kong ones' case, they've actually got backing from the Chinese government. But they are designed to be as, this guy gets clean, so I don't. This guy gets dirty, so I can stay clean.
I do remember my question originally before, but I have to, because these companies are organized. They're actually incorporated. So even in the dirty world, there's some legitimacy where they've got some corporate protection. And, I guess the money still has to check out. It still has to be accounted for somewhere. You've got this absurdist thing where you've got like a SEAL, a Ranger, and, a South African Special Forces guy and applying for jobs. And they're like, So what's your dental like?
And that is absolutely correct. In fact, when it comes time to usually when a lot of recruitment is flipping over when they go to re-sign contracts, these guys will send reps out to, just like any other headhunter, and they'll say, hey, how would you like to only work 3 months a year and earn 4 times as much? It's the private market, and a lot of PMCs, when you actually speak to them, will actually compete. They'll go, well, the Hong Kong company's offering me this, and another, South African company's offering me this, and the American company's, not as great at the medical stuff, but I am going to get, about 20% more pay. It is, there's a shopping round for really good operators, and these guys compete with each other for people. So it's very much like the private industry.
What is the range that can be made, low to high end, in US dollars on an annual basis for?
So low end is we're talking what? So quite often, at one end of the scale, you get what the UAE, the Emiratis do quite often is they will go to particularly Chadians, so people who live in Chad and in sort of north, in the Sahel region. Because a lot of those Chadians have been fighting for years, they're actually good fighters. So they know what they're doing. They're good with, usually close combat fighting. And they will go to them and say, hey, look, I'm a private military company. I'll pay you $6,000 a year, because that's good money, to just sit in a air-conditioned jewelry shop in Dubai and just sit there with a shotgun and guard the jewelry shop. To which sounds great. It's air-conditioned. It's better. Why not? Let's do it. And then they sign the contract, and then week 3 of training, they're doing heavy machine gun training, and they go, why am I doing this before they're deployed into Syria, or they're deployed into Libya, or they're deployed into somewhere else, or Yemen particularly? On the other side of the scale, you can get guys who are earning $500,000-$600,000 for doing very interesting work. But most of those guys are people who probably have a lot of local contacts they can rely on. So it's very much we're going to pay you, but you're probably going to know the local guys who we need to bribe, or you have personal relationships, or you're going to know how to get out of the airport quickly, or, you have a specialty skill set. It is 100% the private market of, we'll pay you more if we think you're worth more. The American companies tend to usually pay a little bit better. But again, if they really want an operator, the Hong Kong guys will outbid them, or the Emiratis will outbid them. But again, it's such a wide spectrum between people going out to Chadian villages and getting people to man machine guns to, going after very senior, or very elite US forces and saying, hey, I know you're up for re-enlistment. Why not re-enlist, and we'll pay you 4 times as much.
So your typical movie scenario is that you have multiple PMCs operating in the same zone, either from different, or oftentimes in a movie, of course, the same international, or the CIA. They hire 3 different PMCs, redundancy, or to eliminate each other, or whatever the dirty plot is. But I'm not even really sure what the question is any longer. I've lost it, of course. But they're paying, like, on the high end, $500,000 or $600,000 a year. But there's not these multi-million-dollar caches of checks, or these unlimited amounts of money.
Yeah, some of them are, because some of them are like, hey, sign for a 10-year contract, and you're going to be doing operations for training everyone. It's how much does a person get paid in the electronics industry. It really is completely varied on where you're from, what you can offer, how long your contracts are. Some of these PMCs just sign effectively, 2 or 3 week contracts. They're just going in and doing 1 escort and they're out. Others are signing 10-year contracts where they're not only effectively, doing operating time, but they're also training up more PMCs as they go out of the military.
I didn't lose.
It completely differs on what sort of contract you sign.
I regained my question. What was that? How often does it actually happen where an agency or different agencies hire different PMCs in the same zone? And do PMCs ever work together? And do they have like a joint venture agreement? Because like only a lawyer would be curious to see what that joint venture agreement looks like. It's probably ridiculously dull and looks like every other joint venture agreement. But I would really love to see it actually. But does that happen?
Again, we never know the full extent because we don't know. A lot of PMCs will never even notice they're there. There might be a guy driving to the airport and we don't notice the 2 cars behind him that are full of PMCs that frankly will not actually pop out of that car unless things have hit the fan. There are times where they have worked together, even in Iraq, even particularly in Syria, where there were Wagner guys and American PMCs and American troops and Russian troops, and it gets really messy. And in fact, there are times when PMCs have been fighting other PMCs. That was happening a lot in Libya, particularly. There are times where you have PMCs going against, quite often the American companies will actually do things out of the American interests, whereas Russian PMCs never fight Russians. It's almost never unheard of that they'll go fight Russians. Whereas it's really not that it's not out of the question that American PMCs will go blow up or attack infrastructure that would be helpful to the Americans, because again, it's more free market rather than the monopoly that effectively Prigozhin has. But yeah, it's not unusual. I mean, again, we never know the full extent of how tied these guys are yet, but particularly in Yemen, in Libya, and Syria, we've seen PMCs fight PMCs. We've seen PMCs fight, national armies. We've seen national armies fight, all sorts of stuff. So it gets really messy and really muddy because the front lines are so weirdly muddy.
I know they bid for labor, for expertise. Do they also bid on jobs?
Occasionally, again, it's a lot of it will be you contract out. You'll maybe approach a few PMCs and maybe get a tender. But again, it depends what the job is. If it's something really, really, really sensitive, it's, hey, I need you to eliminate this, member of government. You would want to tell the least amount of people possible to make that happen. But if it's something like, hey, I'm protecting a pipeline, then 100% you would be going out to 4 or 5 PMC companies and seeing what their bids are and what they can offer and what they can protect and going from there. Again, it's very similar to, how the guys that will be wearing the armored vests as they get the ATM cash out.
Do they ever? And I have a feeling the answer is, it depends on the type of job. So let's call it a medium to high risk job, but not like your secret wet work kind of, black op kind of job. Protecting a pipeline in a in a revolutionary zone. Let's say you have one PMC protecting the east side of the pipeline and you have another PMC protecting the west line. Do they give each other heads up so they know not to engage with each other? I mean, they probably want to engage with the locals, but they don't want to engage with other professionals.
They probably will. Again, because the PMCs don't want to die.
Right.
No one wants to die.
Right.
And if their goals are similar, then most countries will let them know. For the same reason that the Americans will do things like, if they're going to absolutely rain fire down upon a certain place in Syria, they will quite often actually tell the Russians they're about to do it.
Right.
Because it doesn't matter if the Americans, hit Syrians, but if they hit Russian soldiers,
right.
That could be, it could escalate to something worse.
Right. It's not the measure of the life. It's we're intending to hit Syrians, but we don't want to, start World War III over this. So let's tell the Russians or the Turks or whoever else might be there, you may want to clear out, and then I guess they just take the risk that the Russians right tip off whoever their best friends are in the Syrian regime.
So obviously, particularly in the dying, when we were all running out of Afghanistan, effectively, there were some PMCs in there who were effectively getting private citizens out of the country. That was quite a big occurrence. And there were also the US military doing the same thing. And if they'd seen each other, operating in the same space, they probably would have just gone, yeah, we're both trying to get out of town. Who cares? Yeah. Live and let live. There's no reason to get engaged with each other on that.
Right.
There are very few occasions where a PMC would want to fight another PMC because it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
As I said, most of the job they're doing is either protecting pipelines is probably not a classic example because that's a long-term job. A lot of it is protecting moving targets and protecting, again, the real classic PMC better bread and butter is get an oligarch from the airport to his meeting and back to the airport because the route to the airport goes through a bad part of town.
I see. So a lot of them operate in Chicago, I guess.
There are far worse places than Chicago.
Baltimore. I don't know.
There's always Gary, Indiana. That's all that's all we have.
Can you imagine an oligarch going to Gary? Like, what Russian oligarch going to Gary? What are they going to Gary, Indiana for? Unless they're like a Jackson fan.
Yeah, I've been in a lot of active war zones over the years, and yeah, even they know Gary, Indiana is not a fake place to be.
Wow, that is all right. So a long time ago, before I sidetracked us 12 times over, I was asking who are the big players. We got Wagner, we have Frontier Services. Who are some of the other names that are out there? The top 5 or whatever.
I probably wouldn't name names unless it's I'd be hesitant to name names because they do get litigious occasionally. And also, it may be out of date by the time we do it because they do change their names so often.
Okay.
You see the same oligarchs who regularly appear, and in fact, a lot of the PMCs will pretty much stay in the same companies, but it is a shell game because the moment any investigations get close to them or they get a reputation, everyone changes because that's the whole point of it. They are meant to be as anonymous as possible, which is why, a lot of people don't even know PMCs exist, or they have this idea that it's soldiers of fortune who, go and do CIA wet work, when effectively it's as I said, most of the time escort missions, but they know that they can eliminate anyone in their way.
Right.
So, I have friends who run mine sites in Africa, and they will always have a couple of PMCs with them. They will 100%, if, they will give one warning to any sort of locals on the mine site before they open fire. And they know they have the ability to do that. And that's why they're hired, because local cops wouldn't do it, soldiers wouldn't do it. And that's why they're hired. But yeah, they'll change names so often because they don't want to ever be recognized effectively. And they're all really sort of generic names, like I would say exact ones, Frontline Services and Defense Solutions. It's all kind of that. And it doesn't matter.
Right.
You track the oligarchs, you don't track the companies because the companies change so often.
Right. You could just as easily see them on the commercials during your professional wrestling reruns, trying to sell you tactical glasses that have no glare.
No, they would 100% never advertise. Because PMCs don't have what the wider world does effectively, where it's, you're not selling Colgate toothpaste.
Right.
They only have a very small amount of customers, and it's a very small pool of people. It's effectively national governments, and there's only a few that really use them quite often. It's very large shipping companies. So, for instance, Maersk, a few of the big shipping companies will hire them quite often. It's one of the reasons that piracy went down so dramatically after, in the sort of around the Somali coast, is because all the shipping companies just started hiring PMCs. Because whilst the German and French navies and whatnot have, they're not allowed to shoot fishermen.
Right.
PMCs just literally, let the machine gun rip when anyone got anywhere close to the boats. And everyone turned their back, and the ships just went, no, I didn't see anything.
Right.
And because of it, piracy went right down. So that's why they got hired, because the national navies can't do that.
Right.
So so it's very difficult to put exact names to.
Understood. You can't say names. The rules of engagement were engage. So no names allowed. Got it. I have one personal story with PMCs, which is very tangential and not even necessarily them, but I think it probably was. And it was in an airport, and there were a bunch of guys, and they were wearing their Blackwater hoodies. And this was totally during the time that everybody knew who Blackwater was. And it might have been right before the name was changed. I don't know if these guys knew it or not or whatever. It doesn't matter. But they did not care that you knew they were Blackwater. They were all wearing the same hoodies. They all had hats. Some of them were competing over how much swag with Blackwater they could wear and carry, their backpacks and whatever. And I don't know. I think it's like if you were Hell's Angel. They're daring you to look at them and say something. And nobody did, and nobody would. And in fact, I think that probably a few people, this was obviously, after 9/11. Otherwise, why would anyone know what a Blackwater is? And it was, probably, sometime in the mid to late aughts, because,
my guess is about 2006.
Probably.
For a betting man.
Probably about right. And I bet you we even felt safer in the plane. I don't remember that far back, but I'm not even sure there were sky marshals yet. But you sort of felt like you had three or four more sky marshals in the plane. Anyway, but they were definitely proud and loud, loud with their body language, not with their voices necessarily.
Again, because they're being paid a lot more, and if they're around other people who've served in the U.S. military, they're walking around with things saying, I'm doing the same job as you and I'm getting paid 4 times as much and I have no restrictions and I can come and go as I please, and rather than you being deployed for 6 months in Afghanistan, I'm here for 3 weeks and I get to go home and I'm paid a lot more money. And yeah, that's a nice little bragging point to everyone else. But again, I don't think people would be wearing Blackwater stuff around as much as they probably used to.
No, it had the claw, it had the big claw print on
the big
the
old bear claw. I know the one very well.
Yeah, it was the real deal. Nice looking gear. Anyway, moving off of that. So all right. So where are sort of the top zones? I mean, aside from Ukraine, that they be operating now, either substituting for actual security or maybe being agents of chaos?
Okay, so your real hotspots are your Central African Republic, Mozambique, Guinea, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, South Africa is really big for them. Nigeria has a lot of them. Guinea-Bissau's got some, particularly for the new drug trade that's really coming in there at the moment. There's some in Sierra Leone as well. Mostly Africa is where you're going to see a lot of PMCs, but there's also a lot in southern Philippines, doing some work out there. There's a lot in South America, who, again, mostly doing escort missions. Some of them are hired by drug cartels for, very heavy hitters. There are some hired by the Mexican cartels as very heavy hitters. But majority of PMCs you see operating in particularly Africa they will be guarding mine sites, or they will be doing things like what they are in Central African Republic, which is we guard the president, we run the streets, we effectively give security to Bangui, the capital, and probably the few of the mines, but they're filling their pockets with diamonds and laundering that through the UAE. That's how that operation will be working. It's a good source of, for Russian, it's great because it puts Russia out there as a security guarantor again, which they wanted to be again since the fall of the Soviet Union. B, they get paid in very good currency. Diamonds is great because you can launder it really, really easily. And C, effectively, they are providing the security for the president, and now the president knows that if he were ever to cross Putin, then his security, it's not his security around him. So that's not a great position to be in if you're the president of the Central African Republic. But that's a very common, to see them out near mine sites or guarding highways to mine sites or guarding near the president. Because again, it's very similar. There's a lot of clips out there that used to be from the old French operations out in Mali, where you would see this body cam footage, and we could see it from both sides because some of the Malians were trying to put stuff on YouTube as recruiting gear, and they're very young. They're not really trained at all. They're just they're firing their Kalashnikovs over the wall. They're spray and pray, and then you kind of they'll be attacking, let's say a facility, a town, whatever it is, and then your PMCs or your French Foreign Legion guys will rock up and they'll just pick them all off one by one, and the whole battle's over really quickly once they get there. That's also not an uncommon thing that they're just deployed there to be effectively, we're not going to pick a side, but we're going to hurt one side if they attack the other, so we can play everyone off against each other. Because again, for a lot of particularly international mining companies, and I'm not going to name names otherwise my lawyer will yell at me, but if you're a mining company and you go to somewhere really stable like Australia and say, hey, I want a mountain, I want to get all the bauxite out of that mountain. They go, fantastic. You got to charge this much, and you got to build this many jobs, and you got to do this much infrastructure. And he goes, okay, that's really expensive. If you go to an African country, they're still going to demand quite a lot of the same things. But if you have a country which is at civil war or has diverging factors in the country, that way you can effectively go to the president and say, look, give me the mountain at 10th of the price, or I will give your opposition a lot of guns and I'll give him the contract and he'll give it to me once he's taken your job and eliminated your entire family, and then he'll give it to me for free as a payment for that. So your choice is to either give it to me at a discount or I go across the street and I go to your enemies. Right. And that's why a lot of these countries, there's a huge advantage for international conglomerates, a huge advantage for outside players to keep them at this balance point where they're not quite strong enough to eliminate each other. And if one gets too strong, they'll boost this one up, they'll both come back down, and you keep the balancing act. So there's always that leverage of play ball or I help your enemy. And that a lot of these African countries are in that position.
Now, let's say I'm Nole Kasum and I am a multinational quadrillionaire and I want to get into the mining game. But, I'm an overnight success because that happens all the time. I'm basically the Mark Zuckerberg of my industry. Like nobody knew who I was, and a week later I'm a billionaire.
Yeah.
And I need help. How do I find myself a PMC? Like, what is the anatomy of the search? Do you actually look for, like, go to regular security companies and ask the right or wrong question, and someone says, I know a guy who can help you, or to say,
these guys have Googleable sites, and anyone at that level, once you get to that kind of level, where you have a lot of money, it's, bankers will know quite well who to be talking to. Okay. If you want anything done, you'll be talking to local fixers and operators. Quite often, so fixers is a really common job in these kind of areas. I used to do a lot of fixing work. I still do a bit of fixing work, where and sometimes fixing work is as simple as, like the other day, it's like, hey, I need a cameraman who speaks Russian and Georgian, and I need him in South Ossetia in 6 hours. And blank check if you can get it done. Okay, yep, fantastic. I'll make some calls. And you rely on people like me who have these very long phone books that you can just call friends and say, hey, look, pay you this much, and I need you to get out to South Ossetia real quick.
By the way, I can tell the world this is a podcast, but Mike Hilliard looks exactly like Harvey Keitel in Pulp Fiction right now. By the way, we now have the name of the show, the Fixers.
Yeah, actually, the Fixers is a really good one. Yeah. So once you get to that world, you'll start calling fixers, and fixers would know. So, but a lot of these companies will have websites. But if you message them and say, hey, can you guard my 6-year-old's birthday party next week, they're going to probably tell you to go away. Some of the bigger ones will only want contracts that are worth multi-million dollars.
Sure.
Don't talk to you unless you're a national government looking to, effectively long-term guard embassies on a second run. Yeah, it really does. Again, I feel like I've said this 100 times all night, but it is horses for courses. Everything's different. But yeah, these guys have websites,
right.
But usually there'll be fixers, or people can direct you to the right ones, or there'll be people in that area of the world who know what to do.
Right, it's the free market. If you want to get Taylor Swift to do a concert, either you need to run the Meadowlands, or you need to be quadrillionaire and say, yeah, I want you to play my kid's 10th birthday. No, I'm not doing that. Oh, but I'm the emir of Jeffzikistan, and I will give you $42 million to do it. Oh, okay, sounds good.
Case, they rock up. That's pretty much how it goes.
That's okay. Yeah, so it's just like everything else. Then it's the market forces. It's a sort of capitalism gone wild, but it runs even where there's not capitalism. So. You said it's hard to track, but around how many, like, on the higher end companies are we talking dozens? Are we talking scores? Hundreds?
We're talking easily a couple hundreds, because some of them are really small. Some of them will only be like 6 dudes. Others will be thousands of operators, and it really is. Wagner's much bigger than that. It's almost like how many electronics companies are there? Right. Yeah, there's the big guys. There's your Samsungs, your Apples, your big sort of your Frontier Services Group, your Wagners, but there's also really small operators who will only have 6 or 7 guys, who will probably only pick up very, very localized contracts. So they might, I won't give examples, I'll just wink, nudge, nudge kind of stuff, but for instance, there are some that will only operate Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, and their only guy they contract with is usually the French mining company Total. And they don't need a lot of operators for that. If they're just getting guys and effectively guarding the airplanes when the French French executives land to go check it out, then you don't need a lot of guys.
It's like the Templars.
There are others.
You just need your 9.
There are some companies where on the books there's only three or 4, actual people who work at the company. It's like Linda from accounting, the CEO, and the CEO's, cousin who is going to get a random job. But they'll also contract out to either other smaller PMCs, which is also quite common, or they'll contract out to they'll find people for the jobs. A lot of these smaller PMC companies will be effectively picked up by bigger PMC companies for larger contracts. So it's really difficult to know exactly how many there are, and how many are registered under security companies, how many are registered under event management. That's another one you can register things under.
Sure.
Because again, the regulation in the countries they're operating in is so ridiculous, to the point where some of these guys will come in on tourist visas, and some of them will come in on working visas, and some of them will come in with no paperwork at all. It really depends on the sort of the situation you're dealing with.
I'm just thinking about a really bad offbeat comedy with like a, Michael Cera or something, where they're running a Comic-Con and they hire one of these places to do top security and they have no idea who they hired, and it becomes a Die Hard kind of thing where some cosplayers, end up, being John McClane. I don't know.
For PMCs, they get rules of engagement. I mean, as much as I've said they can free fire, it's only in certain countries. Right. If a PMC is, let's say, hired to get Mariah Carey to the show, he's not just going to free fire at people as they go through Seattle. But when a PMC is hired to do things in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he'll probably be told when he gets there, it's free fire. It's give him a warning out of courtesy, but it's free fire after that. So again, it's every job will have a different set of rules of engagement. Every job will have a different set of objectives. Every job will have a different set of pay. Every job will have a different set of nationalities working on it. It really is just a really, really deregulated, really sparsely different world.
Are there places that beyond regular security that we're talking about, getting Mariah Carey to the contract, or getting the Russian oil oligarch who needs to talk to the governor of Texas or whatever, or North Dakota or Vancouver, getting them safely from place to place? Do they operate in like the United States, Canada, or, Australia, beyond those security jobs?
Yeah, of course, because they will be, if you are very worried about something going on, that's kind of a higher end version of it. So quite often, if you're a big Hollywood star and you're very worried because your entire tour bus has to drive through Cary, Indiana, you might hire one or two of these guys just to kind of be there for that leg of the trip. It's very doable, and sometimes the bigger companies will just farm out someone for a good chunk of money. Sometimes it'll be a very little company. It's effectively just a level above security. You can hire we call them like Chubb armored vehicle guys, but that the Chubb guys, when probably push comes to shove, aren't going to be pulling out a rifle and willing to like stand and fight.
Right. Whereas
if you hire PMCs because you're expecting things to go wrong, that's when you expect them to stand and fight. So cartel guys might hire them, but again, it really comes down to how much noise you want to make, how much money you're willing to pay. Because if you think, well, I'm not going to probably come under attack, then the Chubb security guys probably work. And a lot of time you don't want to pay PMC fees and risk, any of that if it's not required. But sometimes it is operating in the US just to get certain people around or do certain stuff. But there's also a cat and mouse game of if let's say they were asked to, attack a power plant in the US, and that all came out, then there's a risk of everyone actually calling for regulation. And so the industry would probably all take hands off and go, it's going to raise a bit too much attention.
Right.
So in Western countries, PMCs are usually very clean. They quite often wear nice white-collared shirts. They're usually quite, reasonable. It's when you get into the places where there are no journalists that they go, safety's off, let's go.
Right. Let's say that hypothetically, allegedly, I am the drug kingpin of Northwest Baltimore. And I'm getting, the East Side is getting a little bit hungry. It's like The Wire. Prop Joe is feeling froggy and wants to come into my territory. And, I've got my corner guys, I've got my hitters, but, I try to reach out to New York, but they remember what happened with Brother Muzan, and they're like, nope, you're on your own this time. Is that a situation where I reach out?
Highly unlikely, because in the US you would be investigated.
Okay.
It would be, particularly if they're US citizens. These guys committing crimes in the Central African Republic, if they have to leave the country, who cares? Doesn't mean they have to come back. Whereas if they're doing it on US soil, that actually will be investigated, and it may end up back at the company, or it may ask questions, or they're likely to be caught on camera doing it, and it's real messy to operate inside a Western country. When it comes to Central African Republic, you don't have to worry about any of that. So it's quite unlikely that you'd want to do it. And again, the US doesn't have the US would at least have laws of you can't just fire upon people randomly. You have to stand your ground depending on the state, and obviously it differs from state to state. But with a lot of the African countries, it's shoot first, ask questions later, and that's how these guys usually prefer to operate. So I'm sure if you were to go pay these guys a bucket load of money and say, hey, look, take me around this area, and if anyone gets rowdy, then we can look down that road. But I don't think there's many PMCs who want to take that job because they know they're opening themselves up for a likely investigation, and an investigation that will actually be done in a country they probably can't leave from because it's got extradition treaty. The US has a lot of extradition treaty countries. So yeah, it'd be a pretty unlikely scenario, but not off the table. I mean, I'm sure there's probably 1 or 2 times it's happened.
Right, you can always find one, especially if the money's right, and let's say they were former Cuban regular. I remember when I was growing up. I'm 54, so when I was growing up, the Russians were in lots of countries, but they almost never sent Russians. There were Cuban soldiers all over the place. You'd think that Cuba was a country of 300 million people. There are Cuban soldiers all through Africa, all through Central America. I mean, Cuban soldiers everywhere. In Red Dawn, they had Cuban soldiers, here invading the U.S. in the movie. So could I reach out to I guess those guys would be very old, but is there still some country where there's a PMC where they're like, yeah, we don't care, we'll operate in the U.S.?
Yeah, it would be really unlikely because again, the U.S. is very robust. I'll put it that way. Security apparatuses, and the U.S. are very likely to catch you. Most of the time, the U.S. major governments know these guys are operating, particularly if they're PMCs and they've been caught on camera doing things before.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the US knows this company, hey, look, it's done a bunch of crimes in Yemen, they're not going to care. They're not going to actually prosecute that,
right? Because
they just don't. There is no way to prosecute it.
Right.
Whereas if they see that person coming into the States, they're going to go, okay, that's someone we should probably keep an eye on. What is he doing here? And that's where you get your problems. So it's possible, but again, it's what would you be doing in the states that sorry, you couldn't solve with private security, or that an armored car couldn't solve? And, if you're bringing a guy who's trigger happy, I mean, there's plenty of guys in the US that are trigger happy enough.
Right. Yes, there are.
You can usually get local cops to do most of that work. So yeah, PMCs are only really designed for when you're going to do something really illegal, or there's an area where you can't rely on security, police, or anyone like that, because they either don't have the manpower or guns to fight back, or B, no cop is going to want to go into a high, fight guys with machine guns. They're just, no one lives in a die-hard movie.
That was a big refrain of the police used to say we were being outgunned by the criminals, and now the refrain 20 years later or 25 years later is demilitarize the police. It's there's always this swinging pendulum, and I always like to say, yeah, everyone's for demilitarize the police until there's a school shooting in your school, and then you're wondering where the armored vehicle is. So I don't know. It's one of those things.
Yeah.
Anyway, so here I go making enemies again. Anyway, so Northwest Baltimore County, my territory. I have to safeguard myself, and listen, nobody would mess with Baltimore County's finest anyway. They would definitely populated only by John and Jane McClane's. No problem here. Every one of them is John Wick and Charlize Theron from Atomic Blonde. So yeah, every single one, without a doubt. It's the happiest place on earth. What else what should I have asked you about PMCs that I didn't, or what should you tell me that didn't have a question to lead to it?
That's a really interesting one.
It's my catch-all because I'm not very good. I'm not a professional, so I figure I throw it on you.
I guess the question that I get asked a lot when I talk about PMCs is where do I see it going, and I see it getting to be a much more prominent part of combat. We've already seen when we introduced the drone programs, effectively using drones to fight wars. The American public really enjoyed that. It was a major shift in a US policy that effectively they could use these drones and they could eliminate entire villages. And yes, there'd be more civilian casualties and things would be messier, but they also didn't lose Americans doing the job. And because they didn't lose Americans, there was no political flashback because of it. When you lose, Benghazi, for instance, was something that was brought up for years and years and years and years and years.
Still is.
And still is, even though probably a bit of a blow-on, but a whole other thing. The trouble is, if it had been PMCs doing Benghazi and the PMCs had been eliminated, not a single person would have really cared about it. It would have been, oh, well, the PMCs, who cares? which, again, these are people, they have families, they have mothers and fathers. They shouldn't, but people should care about them. Is a better way to word that. But, yeah, people don't have that same political attachment if they're PMCs. So, if you are in a hot area and there's a worry about, suffering casualties, PMCs are becoming a cheaper and a more reasonable option. It also, frankly, it's a really interesting thing. We pulled out of Afghanistan without American troops, but we put a lot of PMCs into Afghanistan as well. So, but we can now pat ourselves on the back and go, we got out of Afghanistan, good work us. But there's almost as many PMCs as there were American troops left in Afghanistan. So what actually changed?
Mm-hmm.
Yet, politically, everything changed. Even financially, even geopolitically, how the country is viewed is very different now because the PMCs are not actual soldiers. The US chucking 1,000 PMCs into sort of Colombia would be very different to how putting 1,000 troops on the ground from the US military. So they can be used to effectively get around and have this ambiguity. There's always been that worry by sort of defense guys of what happens if Wagner was to, let's say, invade Estonia. Right now with NATO, we would declare if Russian troops came across the border into Estonia, that's it, Article 5, we go to war with Russia. But if it's Wagner, that's where you get that grey line. And the grey line is really where people don't want to operate because, pre-Ukraine, I think now NATO is quite aligned and on the same page, but there's always that question of if it's not Russia, it's Wagner, it's a bit messy. And then you see maybe a Hungary, a Bulgaria, a few other countries go, well, I'm not coming to NATO as aid. It's just Wagner. It's not the Russians. Then you get into weird, is NATO still doing this? Is it not? And that moral grey area, that operational grey area is where PMCs will thrive. Is that I don't want to get, making calls and making things a bit squiffy that shouldn't be there. So that's where it's going to be more of a problem going forward, and no one wants to regulate it because everyone loves having that card they can play with moral ambiguity.
Well, Estonia is, I know you're just picking a country, but that's in the Baltics, or just north of the Balkans, and it's in Europe. So that would be a bit messy. I understand the gray line, which, by the way, should totally be one of your episodes called The Gray Line, exactly on this situation.
Yeah.
But there has to be, let's say we found Wakanda and it had all this vibranium, this new rich resource. But unlike, Wakanda of the Marvel universe, it wasn't able to be harnessed into enormous technology where, you basically have a civilization that's 1,000 years ahead of everyone else. And, it was just another country, small country in sort of, a less regulated part of the world. But they're sitting on a mountain of, cobalt. Let's just use our favorite color.
We're just describing the DRC at the moment.
Right. And they did decide to get, I understand that Wagner right now is a little bit busy, but let's just say that instead of Wagner, we got Schnagner. And Schnagner is from Jeffzikistan, of course, because it's the best and worst country in the world. And if Jeffzikistan, we have, it's like the Star Wars cantina. We have the worst of all, all in one place available. It's like a bazaar for mercenaries. And they find Schnagner out of Jeffzikistan, which is like Dubai, and they have absolute immunity. Whatever they do is not a crime, as long as they don't do it in Jeffzikistan and pay us, $10 million a year in duties.
Just say Chechnya.
Just say Chechnya, sure. I like Jeffzikistan. We could about Jeffzikistan is so much more fun.
We'll go to Jeffzikistan, but definitely have a country in my mind.
Okay, very good. And could we hire Schnagner to do that gray line to invade Wakanda? And what would the world do in a situation like that?
So that's again one of these situations we don't know yet. Now there's not a huge number of PMCs, so to actually yes, the PMC could probably smash in and take the airport and probably smash in and even occupy some areas. But to actually run a proper military operation is a lot more difficult than that. You need comms guys, you need radio guys, you need logistics, you need medic guys, you need people to make food. Those are things that Wagner is... No one in Wagner, apart from maybe Prigozhin himself, is there to cook They go in, they get out, they do their thing. To occupy a country with Wagner soldiers, so quite often you'll see in Syria where the Wagner guys will go in, they'll smash what do they need to smash, and then it'll be Syrian, allied the Syrian government forces who will then come into the occupation, the logistics, and everything else afterwards. Even when they're operating in countries like the Central African Republic, where we're there for the diamonds,
right.
Or they're in the DRC, which is increasingly seeing more PMC activity. Effectively, these guys are operating around the mine site, and they'll probably guard the trucks as they leave, and that's all they do.
Right.
Their whole thing is going to be, we don't care what happens 1K either side of the mine site, as long as the mine site's secure.
Right.
So that's very much in the capacity of what PMCs can do when it comes to occupying and taking a country. That takes a lot more work, and again, doing something that big scale and bold would bring the conversation up. Right now, PMCs love the fact that the only people having these conversations are effectively geopolitical nerds, policy guys, and people who, frankly, actually probably see the other side of this and go, yeah, this is a useful card for us to keep as well, let's not talk about it. If this becomes a really big story, like it was a few years ago after the Tahrir Square incident with Blackwater, that's when the whole industry almost, was really worried about actually being regulated. That was a huge panic. It's why everyone moved to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Hong Kong to get out of the US, and everyone went really dark and quiet after that. Invading a country would just be Tahrir Square times 1,000 because you'd have to do some real nasty things. So, yeah, I can't see me going down that road yet.
So there's no PMCs with like 200,000 troops, and I don't know if this statistic is correct, but at some point I heard that in a military you typically have 10% fighting force, and the other 90% is your various supply chains and support. Which I guess with technology,
if including supply chains, then yeah, very much so. But yeah, generally you usually somewhere around the 40-50% are probably going to be able to fight. But there's a lot of guys again. Do you count the guys who are in the country? If they are everyone that goes to Afghanistan, quite a lot of them are they'll be just motor pool guys. They'll be guys whose entire job is, I was deployed to Afghanistan and I just sign trucks in and out of the base.
Right.
Whereas there are other guys who will be, they'll be, doing logistics and cargo runs back in Texas. Are they technically? I would argue they're part of the Afghanistan war. They're helping out. They're crucial to keeping that war going. But do you count them as part of that force? Wagner doesn't really have to do as much of that kind of stuff. Quite often, it's very small operations with very small amounts of logistics.
And if you're being paid the equivalent in whatever your country is of 400,000 American US, so you're probably not likely to be willing to live off the land for very long. Hunting rabbits and stuff.
They live quite well. I mean, sometimes if they're in Syria, for instance, or they're in somewhere where it is a bit less hospitable, then they're going to live pretty badly for a little while. But again, it's very temporary.
Right, temporary.
These guys have usually much shorter deployments than proper national military guys get.
So they're in and out, bang, get the job done, get out as quickly and with as little collateral mess as possible. Though collateral mess is a sliding scale.
Look, if I hired a painter to paint my house, he wouldn't be there for 4 weeks living in my house while he paints the house. You get in, he paints it, goes home.
Right.
And that's how PMCs will look at most jobs. It's, we need to get this guy to the airport. We'll fly in a couple of days. He'll fly in a week early. We'll do some reconnaissance, get our ideas together. We'll do the job, and we'll go home afterwards. It is very much we're just hiring almost like a security guard, which makes things very different to effectively long deployment of militaries where you're setting up kitchens, you're setting up medical stands, you're setting up rec centers, and you're setting up pool tables, and you want to be there for a while. You want to make use of the fact that you've actually carted all this equipment all the way to Afghanistan.
Okay. This morning, just before we got on the air or start recording, I got one of my news alerts saying that Ukrainian strike killed dozens of Russians that were just being deployed. Do you have any information on that?
No, I haven't looked at that particular one today. I've been busy on other calls all day, but it's not unusual. The Ukrainians have been striking. Is this a strike inside Russia, or is this just Russian forces?
I don't know. Literally, as one of the little text message things that I get all throughout the day from various sources that I don't know how they come to my phone, but they do.
There's quite heavy fighting, particularly around Bakhmut at the moment. So it's not unusual. There's probably a lot of strikes on Russian forces at the moment. The Ukrainians have been doing some strikes inside Russian territory, which is a bit of an escalation compared to what a few months ago. But mostly these are either strikes on Belgorod, which is right over the border pretty much from Kharkiv, or there'll be some Russian air bases that are quite forward deployed. So pretty much, usually within about, I want to call it about 300 Ks of the Ukrainian border. The Ukrainians haven't gone for the kind of real big strikes that the Russians have against apartment buildings and whatnot. Right. But that also comes down to the fact that Ukrainians have a lot of precision missiles still left because the US are throwing them at them, whereas the Russians are running really low on precision missiles. So right now it's at the start of the war, and it's very much analogous to if I'm going to if I'm robbing your car, I don't want to break the windshield as pull you out of the car. Right now, Russia knows they're not going to get this car. Let's break the car. And also because they're running out of these really precision missiles, they're just using dumb bombs effectively, which means that, okay, we don't know if we're going to hit that building, so let's just throw 100 shells at it and we'll hit everything around that building. Some of their artillery guys are really good enough to hit that one building, and that's fine. But yeah, whereas Ukraine is using a lot of precision-guided or radio-guided munitions, which effectively means they're not firing. When they fire into Belgorod, they're usually just hitting a fuel refinery plant, or they're hitting a key bit of infrastructure. Whereas when Russia is firing into Bakhmut or firing into Kiev or firing into these major Ukrainian cities, they're hitting everything because they really don't have as many precision-guided weapons as they once did.
Yeah, well, granted, I only got what would be considered half a paragraph, but my impression is that this was sort of probably a staging area for some of these new recruits, conscripts, and is probably to put the fear of Satan into them, that these guys are already weren't really ready to go on the front line, and
that's happening huge amounts on both sides. I mean, the trouble with this conflict is obviously here in the West, we get lots and lots of pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia stuff. Mm-hmm. And if you sit on the Russian Telegram, or you sit in VK, you're sitting in Russian circles, you're hearing all the opposite.
Of course.
It's usually somewhere in the middle. I mean, that Ukraine's having a lot higher, particularly in Bakhmut, which is in where the major battle is at the moment. Ukraine's wounds are a lot higher by the looks of it, because frankly they are getting a lot of artillery shrapnel problems because Russia's just launching so much artillery at them at the moment. But they're also having a lot more survivability rate because they're coming back off the front lines and they're pretty much going straight into Ukrainian hospitals and whatnot, whereas the Russians really haven't got great infrastructure ready for this until they either hit sort of the Luhansk and Donetsk kind of areas where they've been fighting for since 2014, or they go back into Russia, in which case you lose a lot. There's a much higher chance of someone bleeding out and dying if they have to go back to Belgorod, whereas Ukraine has got infrastructure right there and then. Their supply lines are a lot shorter at the moment. So, yeah, it's when we see these sort of we killed a bunch of Russian soldiers today, yeah, we probably lost a bunch of Ukrainians doing it. The Ukrainians are doing better than the Russians at Bakhmut. They're not losing nearly as many men. But the Russians are also doing a lot of frontal assaults at the moment, which is, you're always going to lose a lot more men doing that.
It's a very strange war in a lot of ways. It's a very modern war, not in the way of style of fighting, but in the way that it's really being kept mostly to the confines of Ukraine. And I think part of that, I think Ukraine is adopting some discipline because they want to have a PR campaign to the rest of the world. Russia really just needs to play to their own domestic crowd and people who are already on their side. But the Ukraine, if they start hitting apartment buildings in Russia, they're gonna, the weaker part of the coalition is gonna fall off, and they really can't risk there being any voices. Again, they've got to be sort of as high road as possible without being irresponsible in their defense.
If they start killing lots of Russian civilians, then they do lose that moral high ground, and it does give an opportunity for some of the less enthusiastic partners in the conflict to go, somewhere like I'm not going to say France, but kind of France to probably go, maybe we should, talk about scaling this back because obviously the war's getting a bit out of control. It also worries about escalation. Right now there is a lot of resentment in some of the Russian cities towards the government because these guys are fighting an enemy that they don't view as a threat.
Right.
Whereas if Ukrainians go and bomb an apartment building and kill, let's say 100 Russians who are living in there, every one of their families is now being radicalized. They're going to go, whoa, you just struck my babushka. My babushka did nothing wrong. That's it. I'm joining the military and I'm going to avenge my babushka. That you want to avoid that if you can, because you see what it's done to the Ukrainians. There was a very different vibe in a lot of the general public in the very first days of the war, where it was awful, but the Russians were only targeting military installations on the first day. They missed a few times, which is where they hit apartment buildings. But there was a very different vibe. Now it's that everyone has watched their power get cut. Everyone has friends that have been hit. Everyone's in this for the fight now. They've been radicalized. They're ready to fight. Whereas in the first days, there were so many more people who were just fleeing over the border going, well, I don't want to be a part of this. Where a lot more people are staying and fighting now because they've lost friends, they've lost loved ones, they've lost houses. So it's a real conundrum. And when you speak to U.S. military generals, particularly some of the guys who were operating in Iraq and Afghanistan, they'll tell you that sometimes, you'll get that, you'll get that operative, you eliminate the fighter, but now you've just made his whole family radicalized.
Right, you've lost the war. The old martyr question. What about Belarus? What is that? That wasn't much of a question. What about Belarus? It's got lovely coasts. No, are they? Belarus itself is not exactly a power, but it's But as far as opening another front, their leader is weak, but aligned with Putin. Their people don't seem to be all that thrilled with their leader, or their involvement in the war. I think there's something like 1,500 or 3,500 Russian soldiers there, which is not a lot, but that could, what is the likelihood of opening up a Belarus front, and would that force the hand of, say, countries like Poland and the Balkans, to say no?
So I've only got about 10 minutes left. I've got to jump
That's
on the
fine.
call, but so Belarus is a really interesting case. So effectively, for years, Lukashenko, who's the president of Belarus and has been president since '94, actually really doesn't like Putin. Putin and Lukashenko have a bit of rivalry going back between themselves back from the '90s. But anyway, effectively, Lukashenko has been increasingly turning it into a dictatorship, but up until 2020, he was able to play both sides off each other, both the EU and Russia. So whenever Russia would get too friendly with Belarus or would get too demanding, then Lukashenko would start opening up doors to the EU and be really friendly. And quite often, if you go into places in southern Lithuania, for instance, on a Saturday afternoon, you're at a mall, most of the number plates in the car park are probably going to be Belarusian. It was really common for people to go across the border and everything was fine. And whenever the EU would be too nasty, they'd go back to Russia, and he could play them off against each other. And it was the better thing for Belarus. Then 2020 comes, and he rigs this election beyond beyond imagination. There's a real uprising from the people. The people don't want it, and Putin comes in and saves him. Now, effectively, Putin, the next opposition leader who would probably take over if Lukashenko was removed, is also pro-Russia and pro-Putin. So now Lukashenko either has to do everything Putin asks, or he will be removed. And that's a real bad position for him to be in, because after 2020, the EU's doesn't want to deal with it anymore. They're going, no, you're no longer balancing act. Russia is the only game in town now for them. So they have to do whatever Russia asks. When it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, though, the Belarusian army is not particularly well armed. Most of their old stuff is old Soviet-era tech. It's not really great. They're not particularly well trained in offensive stuff. And Lukashenko doesn't want his best troops going and dying in Ukraine if they need it at home to defend him against the next upset of uprisings.
Right.
So it's also quite unpopular, the war in Ukraine in Belarus as well, particularly in the younger population. So Putin has that kind of math in his head of, okay, if I order Belarus to put their, let's say, 5,000 troops into Ukraine, is it going to change the war? Not really. The Belarusians aren't that well armed. They're not that well trained. It's just going to annoy. It's just going to help, but not really change the war. But it will almost certainly kick off riots throughout Belarus. And what's the point in getting 3,000 Belarusians to come across the border if Russia has to deploy 5,000 Russians into Belarus to keep that situation under control? So effectively, he just goes, it's not worth it. Just stay neutral, do your thing, because you joining the war is only going to make things worse. So the Russians effectively are operating from Belarus. In the original days, the big push through down near Chernobyl toward Kiev was done from Belarusian territory. They still launch missiles from Belarus today, airstrikes in Belarus as well. But Belarus officially will stay out of the war unless things get really dire. And I can't see Putin would pull a lot of troops from a lot of other places before he starts asking Belarus to get involved. And the other reason he won't is because, for the same reason with Kazakhstan, you don't want to put in troops because you want to get 3,000 troops to deploy 5,000 in. But it does allow a semi-back door for getting around sanctions. So right now there's a lot of parts and whatnot that Russia can't get at the moment because of the sanctions, but Belarus probably could. And this way, at least it leaves a back door open for some parts to go to Belarus, which will then be sold on to the Russians.
Right. So it's more important to have that free zone where they can get their stuff rather than get whatever aid and they get from Belarus. And, all right.
They would have done the math and gone, okay, with Belarus staying out, we get a backdoor for some backdoor sanctions. We don't have to go in and defend, put 5,000 troops in to stop the next uprising. Lukashenko stays where he is, and we still get to operate our missiles and whatnot from there. And on the other hand, what we get out of that? A couple of 1,000 troops who aren't that great, who are using really old Kalashnikovs. Not worth it. Just the math doesn't work out. It's not, it's not worth the time.
And we need our people in Syria and Azerbaijan and the other places more.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. All right. So, folks, if you want to know all the various places that Russia has troops deployed that might surprise you, listen to Mike's podcast and listen to the entire catalog, because there's a lot of scary things in the world, and then you can have your hair turn gray like Barack Obama's did. Anyway, I am cognizant of your time. You said you had 10 minutes. That was probably 5 minutes ago. So I'm going to give you this last time to just tell people how they can find you, how they can, support you. I've said the name of the show a dozen times, but it's probably sounds better coming out of your accent.
That sounds far better with you. So if you want to check out what we do do big fortnightly deep dive pieces on one big subject shaping the news, whether that be the CSTO collapse or how difficult an invasion of North Korea would actually be, with experts, usually from the White House, CIA, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, the actual decision makers and experts coming in to give real opinions and give actual analysis on what these situations are. You can listen to the Red Line on your major podcast platforms, whether it be Spotify, Apple, all the good ones. Otherwise, if you follow us on Twitter, we do lots of breaking news panels as well, whether it be riots in Mongolia or current tensions on the Azeri-Iranian border. Otherwise, you can follow our website as well, where there's lots of analysis and writing and detailed pieces. And the last one we just did was on effectively what equipment the Saudis are now buying from the US and how difficult it would be for the Saudis to effectively divulge themselves from US arms sales. So lots of different versions of defense and whatnot. And if you want to, effectively get a crash course on, what's going on in Syria or what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in the Central African Republic, then you can check it out there.
Absolutely. And there was a 5-part series on the Green Line with all the complications of climate change and things like that. And just nothing is simple. And Mike's experts do a great job of breaking it down. It's usually somewhere between 3 to 5 experts. So anyway, I can't thank you enough. I want to free you to the rest of your day. Happy New Year again. And it's always a pleasure having you on the show. I really appreciate it.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. And sorry I have to run to another one. I've already got my producer messaging me at the moment saying, hey, we're in the waiting room. So I'm going to head off and do another one now.
You don't have to explain yourself to me. I'm pleased. Good luck on the other show. Thanks again. And thanks everyone for listening. And check us out next time here in the garden.
Me and no Billy, we both come from Georgia, met Hank out in New Mexico. We're bound for Durango to join Pancho Villa, and we hear that he's playing in gold. I guess a man's got to do what is best, and ain't found nothing better so far. Been called mercenaries and men with no country, just soldiers in search of a war. And we're bound for the border with soldiers of fortune, where we fight for no country, but we die for good pay. Under the flag of the greenback dollar or the peso down Mexico way. Georgia and settle down quiet somewhere. I'll most likely pack up and head south for Chile. Tell us some trouble down there. And we're bound for the border with soldiers of fortune. We'll fight for no country, but we'll die for good pay. Under the flag of the greenback dollar or the peso down Mexico way. And we're bound for the border with soldiers of fortune. We'll fight for no country.